Hello and welcome. My name is Tatiana Kolovu, and today I'm here with my friend Pete Mockaitis. We both had courses that were ranked on the top list of the Leadership Edition in LinkedIn, and we thought it would be a good idea to get online and have a discussion about those. Pete, where are you coming in from today?
I'm coming in from Hendersonville, Tennessee, just outside Nashville, which is apparently recently named like one of the top 20 cities to live on a magazine. So there's some excitement there.
That's
Woohoo.
fantastic.
And yourself?
I am about 4 hours northwest from you, northeast from you. I'm in Bloomington, Indiana, and I've had a very busy day today, so I had to set up in one of our breakout rooms of our university so that I could be with you. And right before we got started, Pete was giving me coaching tips for, turn the light this way, go in this direction. But we're going to spend a little bit talking about our courses, and we'd love for you all who are attending to tell us where you're coming in from and definitely to ask us some of the questions. I'm going to go ahead and drop in. If you don't follow Pete in his fantastic content that he always shares, let me see here, make sure I do this right. You want to be able to do that.
Ooh.
And I'm going to put both of my handle so that it goes in the feed and also Pete's handle in case you want to follow him. But we've promised a action-packed and dense, condensed version of what we have to talk about. Someone is here from Franklin, Tennessee, Pete. But
Oh,
then
fun.
we have an Omaha, Nebraska friend. And a Winston-Salem. I've spent so much time in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, because my aunt and cousins lived there for many years. I love the place. Kostadine, Kalispera, my friend from Greece. And greetings to everyone. Thanks for joining us. So we wanted to get started by talking a little bit about the courses. Oh, sorry, this is getting distracted. It's like squirrel. There's a friend here from Bulgaria. I can't not comment. It's wonderful that you're staying up late and joining our courses.
Yes.
So Pete has an award-winning course called The Language of Leadership. And I'm going to pause for a minute and say, Pete, tell us about how this course came about.
Oh, sure thing. Yes. Well, it started with this is an adaptation of a podcast interview I did with Chris Westfall, who is just an amazing guy. I met him years ago. We shared the same speaking agency when I was doing more keynotes on college campuses at the time. And Chris just really impressed me. He was a elevator pitch champion. He has just a beautiful voice.
I need to get to know him. In fact, I put his link on the feed here so people can follow him as well.
Yeah. And his book is called Leadership Language, and it's just really excellent. So I said, hey, so you got a book coming out. Let's how about you hop on the show? And he did. And so we had an interview, and then later we adapted it as to a course on LinkedIn, sort of getting the best bits and making it a little easier to listen to with some chapter titles and segmentation. And away we went.
Wonderful. So the language of leadership, I'll ask you in just a little bit. We've decided to share our time so that our learners stay engaged. My course that made the list, the same list as Pete's did, was creating or starting a memorable conversation. And I do a lot of courses. I have a lot of courses on communication and cross-cultural communication. I'm what I call myself an academic immigrant. I came to the United States to go to school, and I found quite often I had to strike up conversations because I was either lost or I didn't understand something, or I knew that to get to know people, I was going to have to be the one to start a conversation. So as I've talked to our fantastic content managers at LinkedIn, we crafted a course that really went towards you either have to be known in your company. It was a story I remember. A friend said, I saw the dean in the elevator. He has no idea who I am. And I said to my friend, that's shame on you, because that's something you need to make sure that happens. So from the standpoint of making a connection with someone in the workplace that maybe is at a higher position than you, down to there's a MasterCard commercial of someone seeing Mary J. Blige in the elevator, and she gets so excited, but before she can say one thing, Mary J. walks out of the elevator. So when the time is right, how do you make a memorable conversation? And apparently that was an interesting concept in the in the world of LinkedIn and the leadership edition too.
I
So
certainly thought so. If I can brag on you, I really enjoyed it, and particularly that you brought in some personal stories in terms of your daughter on vacation encountering
yes,
an Olympic athlete. Uh,
seeing someone that she recognized and walking up to them. Yeah, absolutely. Uh, as you can imagine, our kids don't have a choice. They are kind of coached all the time to speak up, to put themselves out there. They've hated it. But I do think it builds good communication skills. What's one of the things what's a story that you heard as you interviewed, as we talked a little bit about, you interviewed Westfall and brought that into the course that you two designed together?
Oh, sure thing. And it's funny when it comes to story is I'm really driving towards, stories and principles that are sort of actionable wisdom for professionals to flourish at work, sort of the tagline and the guiding light. And I think a few things that have really just stuck with me, boy, again and again, is how what you want to convey when you're speaking is it's not so much magical words and phrases. I mean, there's a couple that are kind of handy, but rather the overall sense of I've thought this through.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really great. Whether and it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have 800 slides. Put most of those in the appendix. I would recommend, but rather is that okay? You've anticipated the questions. You've got your answers ready to go. We've got sort of facts and earned secret, as some have called it, available. And in so doing, it's like, okay, I have an extra level of faith or confidence that we can do as this person suggests, because in fact, yes, they thought this through.
And it's not only I've seen a lot of pitches, it's having a storyline without speaking in circles. You're going in a certain direction and there's flow and people can follow you. And they understand what is your idea and why is it a good idea and how does it impact the people in the audience that are following along. That's pretty much it. Is that right?
Oh, certainly. And I think about it in terms of sort of what are the key questions folks are going to have and in what order, and then
Yeah.
what's the best possible evidence you can provide. And then boom, that really
Yeah.
conveys, oh, this person's really on top of this.
And I would have to say that in the United States, we're seen as sort of be direct, get to the point. What is it that you want? But I do
Answer
think
first.
people appreciate a storyline. You know, that the last couple of days I told you I've been with a very a successful executive producer from Hollywood, and she talks about being a storyteller. Everything, if it's a movie or a TV show, you have to capture a main idea and capture it in a sense of a story that people are paying attention. And it's the same way for our presentations. We have more friends from the Dominican Republic and California, Boston, and lots of places, Germany and South Africa. And this crosses along all cultural lines and industries.
Oh,
Is that
sure.
right, Pete?
Story. Well, and Tatiana, I think you're really bringing up a fantastic tension that I felt in my early days of keynote speaking, because I left Bain & Company doing strategy consulting and was all about, answer first, one
Yep.
point, one slide,
Yep.
and then really, focus, hit that. And then in the world of keynotes, it was a bit different than being in corporate conference rooms trying to aid decision making, but rather getting folks to sort of lean in and be engaged and curious about where you're going. And so there's more an emphasis on story. And I always sort of went back and forth, like, well, what's the best way? Like these are very different. And I guess lots of it goes back to knowing your audience. But I had another podcast guest who really dispelled the tension for me. And he said, I think when people say answer first, get to the point, bottom line up front, headlines, what they're really saying is don't bore me.
Or don't
give me
waste
a
my
lot of-
time.
Yeah, don't give me a lot of
Mhm.
extraneous stuff that I don't care about. So you can
Mhm.
either give me a fascinating story that really hooks me in and engages me. Ideally, it's still relevant, of course, and speaks to a point. Or you cut right to the heart of it and say, okay, these are the critical points and the key supporting reasons, and
But
that's that. But by the way,
isn't
don't
that-
bore them.
Yeah, and that's knowing your audience. Sometimes that's what the audience wants. Our friend Matt here says humans love a good story. And
Mhm.
I bet you also mean examples. So you may explain something that's complicated and then you cut in and say, so for example. So let me give you an example, or let me tell you how this plays out in this context. So you transition to an example that makes it a lot more specific in that context. And I think the audience gets it a lot faster.
Oh, absolutely. And one of my favorite 1-2 combos is you share a story of one person. You say, and Matt's experience is not unique. In fact, over the last quarter, we've had 200,000 customers had the same issues. And they go, oh, 200,000. Wow, that powerful story times 200,000. Whoa.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So in the audio book that you first heard, what was one story that captivated you?
I was thinking about, he was referencing a surfer who who is working, frequently surfs on these just huge waves, such that if things go wrong, he could literally die. So that's kind of captivated. And he's like, oh my gosh, what are you thinking about when you're up there? And he said, honestly, Chris, I'm thinking about nothing because you kind of can't. You can't sort of be, and it's the same way when you're delivering a speech. It's like you can't be thinking, it's like, okay, so first I'm going to say this, and then we're going to go to the second.
You got to be in the moment.
Yes. Ideally, you know your stuff and you've prepped it so well that you can just be in the moment.
Yeah.
And sort of enjoy, and kind of read the room and respond dynamically in real time. And it's kind of like you've downloaded the content already deep inside, so that you're able to just flow and have fun and respond in the moment like the surfer. So I thought that was one of my favorite stories there.
I love it. Be in the moment. That's so true. Well, I wanted to transition a little bit so we can talk a little bit about my course, which, by the way, translated this week on Monday. I'll talk a little bit about Stronger, my newsletter. I came up with ideas or things that we've heard as kids growing up that we're not supposed to do, that in a way end up hindering our communication style. Because this don't talk to strangers or don't approach people don't talk unless you're talked to. Sometimes kids hear that, or I heard it growing up. But how does that keep you from understanding how to approach someone when you need to, when you want to strike up a conversation? It could be an elevator conversation, or it could be, in the course, I have a skit that shows someone approaching the CEO of the company at a picnic. How do you approach it that way? And I put in the story about Melina, our daughter, seeing the Olympian and talking about which flavor of ice cream was best. Have you found yourself at any time striking up a conversation that turned to be a meaningful one?
Yes, I really have. And I'm thinking about, I have a business partner now. We started a whole nother business. His name is Brian. He's fantastic. And we do outsourced podcast production services. And so we've got a team in developing countries who help with that. And we just sort of got to talking. It was like, oh, wow, with COVID, you were laid off? That's so ridiculous. You're so great at sales. If I were in charge of that company, you'd be in the half I kept.
Wow.
Hey, and so it's like, well, I've got this crazy idea that I think could really take off. But I don't really have the time to run it. And so now he's running it. and I catch up, we meet up once a week, and he does most of the work, and it's a nice little win-win.
That's fantastic. So you don't have to get in all the technical stuff. And it all started with, did you reach out to him or he reached out to you?
Yeah, we were just chatting. It was like, oh, hey. And this is a friend of a friend introduced us. It was like, oh, this is Brian. He's got a rosary business. Oh, that's kind of cool. So we sort of talked about that for a little while. And then, he's doing some sales over here. It's like, okay, that's cool. And then later we caught up a little later. It's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you were laid off. Well,
that's not fair.
Almost indignant. Like, this is an injustice. Brian is brilliant and excellent. And
well, look at what you made it into. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, by the way, if you're listening, we've got a good other 15 or so minutes that we want to spend. So be sure to share some questions with us. In my course of starting a memorable conversation, the first thing that I ask you to do is observe if you are approaching somebody live that would be assumed. You could always be approaching somebody and co-calling on them, but I would observe and see if they are active on social media or if there's something that you can comment on. But if it's in a live session situation, make sure that they are open to interacting with you. They are looking around or making eye contact, and think of something to say that has to do with either the weather or the situation that you're in, or a comment of something they're holding or what they're wearing, and do it in a light way, not in an intrusive way in any way. And then if you see that the person is open enough, you can always ask an open-ended question. In a way, Pete, this that is happening now was in a way of me starting the conversation, because I've heard your podcast, I have seen you active on LinkedIn, and I wanted to get to know you better. So I reached out and said, I'll do a live with Pete. And Pete was like, who is that annoying Greek?
Oh,
And then I
I knew
remember, I'm
you.
like, are you Greek? Is this a common? And you're like, no, I'm Lithuanian. Oh, I have friends that are Lithuanian. So I threw some of those strategies out at you specifically, but it has worked for me. I've been able to grow my network quite a lot by not being afraid to reach out.
No, it is. It's powerful. And I really love that distinction you made there, especially like if it happens to be someone, I don't know, famous or high powered or high status. And
Yeah.
like the brain can almost get hijacked and sort of almost like a fight or flight, or really kind of worked up, like, oh my gosh, that's a famous person. Oh, I should say,
Yes.
oh, but what
What
should
do
I
I
say?
say? What do I
You
say?
know,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
like to shift it away from, hey, you probably shouldn't say, oh my gosh, you're a famous person, or fund my company, like right out of the
Yeah.
gate, but rather, what am I seeing in the environment? Oh, there's ice cream, there's coffee, there's
Yeah.
snow. Okay,
Yes.
let's
Just
work with
make a
that.
comment.
Hmm.
Back to our guest here at the university this week. She knows a lot of famous people and is friends with very many, and she's very successful herself. And it's so interesting how so many people went up to her and said, I have a script. Can you read it? I'm like, oh my gosh, don't do that. That is embarrassing. You can just say, I've seen your show and I love it. Thanks for your work. That's all. Just leave it to that. If there's a conversation that starts and there is an opportunity, I would say proceed, but don't go up to famous people and go, oh my gosh, I know you. I've heard all your movies, or I know all of the words that you have to say. You can at least say, love your work. That's just good enough, without embarrassing yourself or feeling bad as it is. Don't feel like you have to pitch. What questions do you all have? Where's South Africa? Are you asleep? Please jump in and ask us something. We have someone from Mallorca, Spain joining us, and Boston and California. Jump in with some questions on our courses, the language of leadership, and starting a memorable conversation. Deadly silence. So, Pete, what questions do you get quite often about your course?
Yeah, well, they say, hey, what's it all about? What are some of the takeaways that have stuck with you? And one of them, I think it was when he distinguished three types of listening, which I found very useful, because I catch myself like, I know what's ideal, and then I see myself drifting into what's not so ideal. So he distinguished, there's listening to confirm what you already know, just sort of like, okay, yeah, I know this. Okay, yep, mm-hmm. Sort of, yep, check, just sort of scanning at the surface for, are you going to shock or surprise me in some way? No, I know all this. And then there's listening like a lawyer. You're sort of getting ready to see what's their position and your position, and to defend your position and to counterpoint.
Analyze, yes, get ready.
What they're saying. And then there's listening to discover something new. And he says, yes, that is the ideal place to be most of the time. And I totally agree, because one, that just makes it a whole lot more fun, in terms of it's novel, and we get a little bit of that dopamine surge, like, oh, I never knew that. That's cool. And it sort of guides you in terms of what are the follow-up questions that you ask and where do you steer it. And then you're both having an enjoyable and perhaps memorable conversation, because you're going there. So that's another thing that struck me that I found useful.
We're crossing a little over into the skill of listening, but it's true that we have to check in to realize what is our listening role in this. So our guests maybe that are coming in right now and are watching, they're just soaking it in. They're taking it in. they're not listening to analyze or make sure they win a badge for the best question. And at times, maybe we ask for what type of conversation are we having, or what type of listening. If there's a presentation, do you want me to comment or analyze? So taking a pause in saying, I'm engaging in this, but I'm just going to sit back and soak it in and take it in. It makes us all better communicators.
Absolutely.
So Pedro here is saying, I'm going to post his question. Thank you, Pedro. Developing most communication and negotiation skills requires effective putting strategies, tactics into practice. How would you advise to support the deployment of such soft skills in action? Pedro, thank you for your question.
Yeah, that's a juicy one. Well, it's funny. The first thing that comes to mind is my most recent podcast guest is Vicky Medvec, who is a professor and does negotiation consultations, and she has a lot of. I think that's one of the first steps is just sort of know them, in terms of like what are the strategies and tactics, and to not be like Michael Scott in The Office, like negotiation, okay, all right. He pulls up, I think, the Wikipedia page and is like, never talk first, And Vicky would say just the opposite, like start first. You get an advantage by framing the issues and anchoring and such. So that's probably my first tip, is to just become familiar with them. And the second would be to sort of translate that into language that feels right for you, as opposed to maybe just sort of weird or unnatural or awkward.
Mimicking. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like Pete, you never. What's up? You seem weird. What's wrong with you?
Yeah.
Like to translate those principles into ways that sound like you. And third, to give them a try. And I've had guests suggest that you negotiate all the time instead of only when it's really high stakes, because then you're going to be nervous and not as practiced, but just in all sorts of little circumstances, like, oh, I see this bottle is dented. Do you think we could, take 30% off? And they might say no, but you're still enriched by having, summoned a little bit of courage to go there.
I love that. It's practicing in a safe space. So do it in a place where you are the customer, maybe, and you can bring out that voice. But Pedro, I'm going to focus on the practice side. Soft skills are muscles that if they don't get trained, they don't get stronger. And if you don't practice on a regular basis, you're not going to be able to be better at them, anywhere from negotiation or communication too. So it's really important that you don't give up. And if you have places where it's safe to do a presentation or make an ask, as Pete was saying, you should practice those as well. My friend Shelby, thanks for showing up. Absolutely love that you're here. How do you go about knowing your audience? Do you do some sort of research before meetings or presentations? Can you share how you go about that? Ooh, I have more to say on that.
Yeah, that's a great one. And I think that it varies in every venue and situation. I guess I'm thinking more so, when I've done keynotes or workshops or been a guest on podcasts, usually the event organizer, I can sort of directly ask hey, do you have like a demographic breakdown? What sorts of things do they like versus dislike? One of my favorite questions is, hey, have you done this event multiple times? And if so, could you share the evaluations from the last couple of years, so that I can sort of see, okay, what did people rate highly? What did they rate not so highly? What did they really resonate with strongly versus not so much? And then for my for my podcast guests that are willing to do the work, I've sort of distilled a bunch of my audience data into 4 slides and say, okay, hey, straight up, here are the demographics. Here's what works. Here's what doesn't. And please, when they read it, they really appreciate it, and I appreciate them for having taken the time to prep.
Or if Shelby, you're speaking to a smaller group, I'd say who hits this out of the ballpark, and, find out why and what is it that they do, or what does this audience really bulk back at, or what keeps them up at night. It's the question I usually ask in the business world. Why do they want to spend time with us? Someone else is saying, if you could add 60 seconds more to one of your courses, what would you like to add or explain on? I'm going to answer this in just a bit. But the research, Shelby, knowing your audience is absolute key. And some of it, going back to my course with conversation, sometimes I'll look, if I'm going in a different country to speak, is how did this country's team do in the Euro Cup or in the World Cup last year? So I can comment. What's the political situation? Are there elections coming up, and what do they think? So I can have some connection in building rapport if I know that some of this comes up. I do simple things as just looking on Spotify, what are popular songs, so I can play music if it's a keynote as people come into the room, and I can show some connection, and I've done my homework and I know where that is. I'm going to pop in Matt's question. If we could just add 60 more seconds to our courses, what would you like to add and expand on?
You know, the way I first interpreted that question was broader than just the course at hand, you know, communicating in the language of leadership. And that is, I'm just such a huge advocate for the 80-20 rule, or the one thing by Gary Kelly and Jay Papasan, which is these notions that 20% of what you do accounts for 80% of your results, or what's the one thing I can do such that by doing it, everything else becomes easier or unnecessary. I think it applies to communication and to just about everything, that some things are in fact 16 times as important as others. Like knowing the audience. Yeah, I would say that that qualifies. And so making sure you're hitting the mark. So I think it's easy to spend a lot of time on stuff that makes a little bit of a difference. But boy, if you just take the time, it can be painful and uncomfortable, but to really prioritize and strategize and say, what is the one thing? What is the 20% that's going to be 16 times as impactful as the rest in communicating or being productive at work? It's just game changing.
Yeah. Well, Matt has pushed us to be thinking, because 60 seconds is tight. It's not another video for 3 minutes or 500 words. For me, it would be at times when you try to strike up a memorable conversation, it doesn't work. Back to the story with my daughter and the Olympian and the ice cream, that same summer, because Greece is a popular place for people to go, she saw someone from a very popular show that she was crazy about and wanted to ask for his picture with him, her picture with him. So she built up her courage and she approached him and she said, "It's so great that you're here. Thanks for visiting this island. We have a house here, blah, blah, blah." And at the end, she goes, "Can I have my picture taken with you?" And he said, "No." What if you get rejected from striking up a conversation? I would probably show that, because I show a lot of examples of that. You know, how do you take rejection in that open and public place and say, "Thanks, I thought I'd ask anyway," and walk away with a smile? But demonstrating that communication skill is also important.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm going to post one more question, and it's a big one. Let's read it together, and then we can say our farewells. Georgina says, "I was quite new to a job and my boss went overseas for 3 weeks. This was a sales conference in the office. Someone came into my room and said, 'So you're holding the fort while your boss is away?' I said, 'Yes, and it's okay.' I thought he was a sales manager, so I stood up and asked, 'Sorry, you are?' He said, 'My name is, and I'm someone high up in position.' Oh no, I didn't know who that was, and that was pretty bad. My problem, annoyed that I asked who the person was. He was probably the CEO, right? So that is bad. And how would you have known that this would have happened? But at times you can send a note, say, 'That won't happen again. I apologize. I now know who you are.' I don't know how else you could recover from that.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. And you know, I think that I might just say it's probably, it might be a little annoying, but I don't think it's severely damaging in terms of, how dare you?
Yes,
you know, I don't
know who I am.
That's a little annoying, you know?
Yeah.
That didn't feel so good. I kind of worked hard to get where I am and they just don't recognize it at all. So it might be, it's a little something, but yes, I really like that suggestion associated with an email apology. Is a good one. And boy, I've done worse.
Yeah. You know,
in the category of the mistake.
On the same note, sometimes I encourage my students and business people that I coach is print out the face, know what the faces are going to look like. So there's no surprises. I'm not saying that in this case, she didn't know who was walking in. But sometimes it helps reduce your stress, or a little bit at least what people look like, or even in interviews, it's a very helpful thing to do. So
Mhm.
I'm not sure that would have played out. It sounds like you were blindsided, Georgina. Thanks for sharing that note. So we're reaching about the end of our time. I wanted just to remind you all to be sure that you follow Awesome at Your Job, the podcast that Pete puts together. And with his friend that he recently met, not recently, he networked with and is able to produce a great show. And I also wanted to put a little plug in for Stronger, the newsletter that the edition for November just published on Monday, and LinkedIn picked it up as one of their highlights. So I was really excited to see that. What are the things we learned as kids that hold us back? Pete, I want to say a big, big thank you for coming in from the Tennessee land and joining me in highlighting our courses.
Oh, thank you. This has been a lot of fun. Appreciate you hosting.
Great. Thank you to all for joining us. And if there's some questions we didn't get to, we will respond to them online. You can be sure of that. Have a great rest of your evening and your day. Be well.